Who had grandparents fight in World War II and what stories did they share? Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked the F out, and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. Navy PR makes a lot of people think the Pacific was all Marines when in reality the Army had over 5 times as many divisions deployed there. The fighting the Army did under MacArthur against the vanguard of the IJ during the Philippines and New Guinea campaigns were brutal. A lot of people don't know that the Army had the unfortunate honor of defeating the largest Japanese Banzai assault in history, and also for deploying paratroopers to airdrop onto a tiny contested island. The war was crazy huge, but it seems like we only ever read about D-Day, the Bulge, and Iwo Jima. Yep, it was indeed huge. Every place, village, town, forest, water where combat happened has horrible stories and disasters to tell. My grandpa was in the army. He never spoke about his service, but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp, specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pee butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. Edited. Thanks for all the responses and awards. My grandfather was a trained medic, not frontline, but where they took immediate survivors. The Germans were known, so sabotaged train bridges, and it was standard protocol to stop and inspect them before crossing. Well, his conductor was drunk, and not only didn't stop, but was speeding into the bridge when it exploded. My aunt has the pictures, but let's just say the rubble he was found under. Wooden trains don't just derail, they shatter. Especially off a bridge, was crazy. He described it to me, and I wanted to cry. He lost many friends. Have a letter from my grandfather. It was short, because it was V-mail, but he basically says a friend of mine was killed by a bomb hidden in a cow carcass. Germans were vicious MOFOs with the bombs. They were viscous motherfuckers, weren't they? It's weird because I remember a fact he told me about that train. He was in France during D-Day, outside of Normandy, and he asked me what do you think was the most common injury we treated that day. I said gunshot. He said no. Crazy as it sounds, the bombs hitting the water next to the transport/drop ships in the water created a void and caused the ship to drop, causing all the men with their heavy backpacks to drop down while standing. This resulted in broken backs, knees and other terrible, technically non-combat, I know, injuries. Basically if they didn't get shot, blown up, or drowned they were disabled. I just reread that sentence and realize how awful this war was, man. I think grandpa saw some shit because he never talked about it, and we later found out that he was lying when he said he never saw action. It's really sad how that generation suffered in silence. Men were taught not to show weakness, and it always makes me sad that soldiers didn't receive the help they needed to cope. They still don't. None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager, and it must have been messed up because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. My dad's father was the same. He served but didn't talk about it. My mom's dad served in the Korean War. Jude was a boxing champ in the Navy and happily talked about whatever you wanted. I feel like the Navy would have been a very different experience than the infantry. My grandfather re-enlisted to serve in the Korean War, and I still get chills when I remember the time he casually mentioned I haven't been warm since Korea. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories, he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another," would turn his hearing aid off and nap in his chair. My Opa never spoke of the war either. He was sent to the work camps. He returned once somehow on foot, but was sent back. Oma didn't speak of the war, but right up to her death in 1990s, she would spit if she saw a German. My uncles only remembered the starvation, and that they mustn't talk. They were too young for anything else to stick. My grandfather only spoke of the war when I asked him once to do a presentation at school when I was about 11 years old. Never knew until that day he and his family were hiding multiple Jews up in their barn in Brabant for the course of 2 years. I have never seen 30-11-12-year-olds listen to someone for that long. I still remember all of it. This story was told to me as a child by my grandfather, who spoke more Italian than English. Some details are a bit fuzzy here or there, but it's my favorite and one I remember fondly. My grandfather, like a lot of Italians, was conscripted by the Browncoats to fight for Mussolini in the Italian army. He was sent to fight in the African campaign. Toward the beginning of the campaign, he was struck by lightning and pronounced dead while on a long march during the monsoon season. At the time they were on march to a port or city. The story was a bit hazy here, alongside a column of tanks and artillery. When he was struck, he was not examined immediately, just presumed dead and thrown onto a truck carrying casualties. It wasn't until about a day later, when they reached their destination, that he was properly inspected. He had been laid out with other dead when one of the men assigned to prepare the dead for burial noticed him twitching. A doctor was called over, and he was found to be alive and sent to be evacuated and treated along with other wounded. Before he could be evacuated, someone high in the command changed his orders. Thinking he was a good luck charm, they ordered him to stay with the honor guard for the rest of the war. In reality, it ended up being his own good luck charm, as he avoided seeing major combat the rest of the war. When we were kids, he used to get a kick out of showing the wound to us. When the lightning struck him, it hit him in the head and exited from his calf, leaving a hole in his leg. The skin had grown over it, so you wouldn't know anything was off, except maybe a scar. But where the lightning bolt exited, he could put a finger in his leg down to the knuckle. We all used to ask him to show us, and we'd react like it was the grossest and coolest thing every time. I loved him. He was a great man, who after the war made his way to America to ensure we had every opportunity in life. TLDR, my grandfather was struck by lightning in the war and thought dead, only for them to realize he was alive days later. He rode out the rest of the war as a good luck charm for the command and made it home to his family to later bring them to America. Imagine how terrifying it would be if he woke up in a cart full of dead people. Both my grandfathers served in the US Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA gun on mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital, his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My grandfather was a flight engineer / top turret gunner on the B-17. He was very tight-lipped about his service. I joined the army after he had passed, and my aunt gave me an album of pictures from his time in Europe. It was pretty eye-opening to his experiences. My grandfather was a navigator in a B-17. Unfortunately, any stories of his have come from my father. One was the pilot getting pissed at my grandfather for putting armored plates by where he sat because it added extra weight to the plane, and he didn't want to crash on takeoff. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action, though, aside from that 6-axe action, of course. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it. That's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe, but whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt or uncle. I think my granddad landed 2 or 3 days after D-Day, and he never talked to me about it until a few months before his death. He recalled arriving on the beach and having to cross over the bodies of the fallen soldiers. It deeply affected him. Having him share just a few stories with me before he died this year felt like such an honor, as he never shared much with anyone about this time. Edit. For those curious, my granddad was a sergeant in the 554th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. He also participated in the Battle of the Bulge and was awarded a Bronze Star for his service. Same. My grandpa never said anything about the war until a few months before he died. All he mentioned was that he had a dream about a young man he shot. It turned out that he was a first scout in the US Army and was instrumental in liberating a sub-camp of Buchenwald, or Druff. No one besides my grandmother had any idea until we read his obituary. My granddad was in World War II in a tank destroy unit. He never talked about it, but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there, and said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. LD mess. That's funny your granddad asked if it's still a mess. My grandpa used to give my dad shit because my dad got sent to Germany in '69. When my grandpa was there everything was bombed to shit. He would say my pops had it made because the base had roofs by the time my dad got there. Grandfather was a US sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take one step forward." Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. We had something like that happen after my first deployment. The whole company got together and we were able to call out anyone for a grappling match. One of our SSGs called out our company commander, who was possibly insane and was not entirely loved by the company. The co whipped the absolute shit out of the SSG lol. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a US position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some shell or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. Cheers to the Americans for saving him. Really interesting since most of these replies are from Americans. Thanks for sharing. My grandpa is also Austrian and never shared any details. I only know the story when he lost a toe, froze off, and how he got injured. Artillery strike. I was able to put his story together through his documents though. The only time he had to share a story was when some relatives of a close friend of him showed up. Apparently grandpa had this close friend who was killed in an attack. Grandpa waited for the night, crawled out of the trench towards the enemy, Russians, and recovered the body of his friend. The friend's relatives showed up to thank him years later, and that's why we know. In short, my grandpa was made prisoner, was sent to Germany for work, volunteered to work in a farm. He knew nothing about farming, but though food would be easier to come by, he didn't know German either. Became friends with a little girl there that was a bit older than his own kids. She started viewing him like an older brother. He attended her wedding. Once the war was over, she had a baby boy. He had a third, unplanned child too. Those became friends. Attended each other's weddings. Then they had kids. Me and one of the German kids decided to learn each other's language. Then we studied in each other's country for a year. Thanks, Erasmus program. I attended her wedding last year. We don't talk much anymore. I'm sorry to report. We are not that good at keeping in touch from afar, but rest assured we are trying. My grandfather's friend has a story about a guy who said he was deaf so that he wouldn't go to the war. The guy choosing the people tossed a coin on the floor beside him, and he immediately searched for it. He was sent to the war. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, AK kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though. He could still shoot a squirrel with a gun and a slingshot from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war until they all died. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe for more videos.